Darius Wynn was 38 years old when his wife threw his suitcase across the departure level of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport at 7:15 on a Wednesday morning in front of a skycap, a family of 4 from Ohio, and a Delta gate agent who had seen most things in her 22 years working that terminal, but would later tell her coworker that she had never seen a man pick up a suitcase that had just been thrown at him and do it with that particular quality of stillness. The suitcase was a hard-shell Samsonite, navy blue, 26 inches, and it slid 8 feet across the polished floor and came to rest against a baggage cart, with a sound that caused 3 people to turn their heads. Darius watched it slide. He did not move until it stopped. Then he walked to it, picked it up by the handle, checked the wheels for damage the way a man checks things out of habit, and set it upright beside him. Camille was still talking. He was not listening to what she was saying, because he had already heard the version she was performing and the version underneath it. And he understood both. What Camille did not understand, what she had never once considered in 8 years of marriage to a man she described to her friends as quiet and dependable, which she meant as a diminishment, was that the Navy suitcase was already checked, that Darius had a second bag, that the second bag had been sent ahead the night before by a courier service that worked exclusively with a travel management company he had retained 3 years ago, when the nature of his other work had made it necessary to move without announcing himself. She did not know about the other work. She did not know about the travel management company. She did not know about the man in the dark jacket standing 30 feet away near the priority lane entrance, who had been watching the interaction with patient, professional attention, and who would, in approximately 4 minutes, walk Darius through a door Camille had no clearance to access, toward a gate she had no knowledge of, where a Bombardier Challenger 350 was fueled and waiting with its stairs down. What happened in the weeks that followed would cost Camille everything she believed she had already secured and reveal, in meticulous and documented detail, exactly how wrong her accounting had been. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Darius Wynn had grown up in College Park, which was close enough to Hartsfield-Jackson that he had fallen asleep as a boy to the low percussion of overnight cargo flights crossing above the neighborhood in patterns so regular they became a kind of rhythm, a bass line beneath the ordinary sounds of the house his mother Paulette kept on Godby Road. Paulette was a woman of precise habits and high standards who had raised Darius and his younger sister Kezia largely without assistance after their father's departure when Darius was 6. A departure she had addressed once, directly and without drama, by telling both children that some people were not equipped for the full weight of a life, and that this was information, not condemnation, and that what you did with information was build with it. Darius had done exactly that. He had built with everything he was given and several things he had found on his own. The morning was clear, and the terminal moved with its usual organized urgency. Darius had been up since 4:30. He had made his coffee, dark roast, no sugar, pressed in the glass carafe Paulette had given him for Christmas 3 years ago, and had sat for 45 minutes at the kitchen table in the house in Cascade Heights, going over the documents he had already reviewed twice that week. The documents were not related to the job he was traveling for officially. They were related to the other matter, the one Franklin, his attorney, had been managing quietly for the past 5 months, while Darius had continued to come home on schedule and ask about dinner, and fix the loose, hinge on the pantry door, and do all the small, reliable things a dependable man does so that the people around him maintain their assumptions about what he is and is not capable of. The house in Cascade Heights had been purchased jointly in 2018. It was a craftsman-style four-bedroom on a street with mature water oaks that Darius had been drawn to specifically because the bones of the house were exceptional, original hardwood floors under 40 years of carpet, solid balloon frame construction, a roofline that was architecturally correct in ways that newer construction rarely was. He had spent 14 months renovating it himself on evenings and weekends, which his colleagues found baffling given that he could have contracted it out, but which made complete sense to Darius because the renovation was not a project. It was a conversation. Between him and the house. Between him and the man who had built it in 1938 and whose decisions he had been reading and assessing and, in most cases, respecting. His work was in logistics. Supply chain architecture for a regional firm that moved pharmaceutical components between manufacturing facilities across the Southeast. It was precise work. It was invisible work. It required the ability to hold many moving parts in exact relationship to one another without any single failure propagating through the system. He was very good at it. Camille was still asleep when he left. She had come home late the night before from what she described as a team dinner, and he had been awake when she came in, not performing sleep but genuinely considering what he would do in the morning and how he would do it, and what it would mean when it was done. He had watched her reflection in the dark window above the kitchen sink from where he sat at the table. She had moved through the kitchen without turning on the light, which meant she was being considerate or she was being careful, and he had stopped being able to distinguish between the two approximately 7 months ago. He had met Camille at a professional conference in Savannah in 2015, which he had attended because his director had insisted, and which he had almost skipped because he was in the middle of a renovation project on a rental property in East Point that was at a stage requiring daily attention. She had been presenting on regional distribution analytics, which was adjacent enough to his own work that the conversation they had afterward had been immediately substantive rather than forced. She was sharp and organized and had a laugh that arrived without warning and seemed to surprise even her. He had liked that she asked questions about his work that were specific enough to demonstrate she had actually listened. He had been careful with her from the beginning, the careful way a man is with something he recognizes as genuinely valuable. What had changed was not any single thing. It was a drift, gradual and then suddenly undeniable. The way a bearing fails not in an instant but through accumulated stress, each day's load adding to the previous until the cumulative weight produces something irreversible. A new attentiveness to her phone that had not existed 3 years earlier. Trips to Birmingham for work that coincided with weekends and generated no expense reports she ever discussed. The quality of her presence in the house shifting from genuine to performed, the way a load-bearing wall replaced with a decorative column still holds the ceiling for a while before the ceiling begins to show the strain. He had noticed. He always noticed. He had a logistician's relationship to information. He collected it, categorized it, cross-referenced it, and waited for the pattern to become unmistakable before he acted on it. The pattern had become unmistakable in March. His college friend Marcus, who worked at infrastructure for the hotel group that managed several properties in Birmingham, had sent him a message that was 4 words long. "Call me when private." He had called from his car in the parking garage at work. Marcus had told him what the hotel's guest records showed for a room booked under a name Darius did not recognize, but that Marcus had linked, through a loyalty account used to accumulate points across bookings, to Camille's email address. An email address Darius recognized, because it was one she had used since before they met, but had apparently never thought to retire or replace. Marcus had been direct and brief. He had not offered opinions. He had said what he knew and then said, "I thought you should know." And Darius had said, "Thank you," and that had been the entire conversation. He did not react. His hands were on the steering wheel, and they stayed there. He sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes. Then He drove back to the office and finished the afternoon's work. Because the work had a schedule, and the schedule had dependencies, and allowing personal disruption to propagate through a system was not how you maintained a system. That evening, he had opened his laptop in the home office and begun building what he privately called the inventory. Over the following 6 weeks, he inventoried everything he knew, everything Marcus's information implied, and everything he could verify independently through the careful kind of attention that does not announce itself. He accessed the joint account records and found, over 19 months, a series of withdrawals that were individually modest and collectively significant. $61,000 moved in increments calibrated to remain below the threshold that would have triggered a bank notification. He found a second credit card account, in Camille's name alone, that had accumulated $38,000 in charges across hotels, restaurants, and flights to cities she had not mentioned visiting. He found the name. His name was Derek Solis, and he was a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical distribution company, a competitor of the firm Darius worked for, and he drove a black Range Rover and lived in Homewood, Alabama. And he had, according to public records, a prior divorce that had concluded 18 months before he and Camille had apparently begun their arrangement. He had opened a new folder on his desktop and named it simply Inventory. Then he had called Franklin Osai. Franklin Osai practiced family and civil law from an office in Buckhead that looked like it had been designed to suggest that money was a byproduct of competence rather than an end in itself. He was 51 years old, Ghanaian American, deliberate in his speech in the way of a man who had learned that precision in language prevented most of the problems that imprecision created. He had reviewed the inventory Darius brought him, the bank records, the card statements, the hotel records Marcus had provided, the timeline Darius had built, and he had done so without expression until he reached the final page, at which point he set the folder down and removed his reading glasses and looked at Darius directly. "You built this yourself," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Darius said. Franklin replaced his glasses. "The documentation is clean. The timeline is airtight." He turned a page. "The joint account withdrawals constitute marital waste under Georgia law, which means they are recoverable in the settlement." He looked up again. "But I want to understand something first. The property in Fayetteville. Walk me through it." The property in Fayetteville was a warehouse conversion Darius had purchased through a private holding entity in 2019, a year after the Cascade Heights house. Using proceeds from the East Point rental property sale and a portion of the royalty income from a logistics methodology patent he held jointly with a former colleague. A patent that generated between $60,000 and $90,000 annually through 2 licensing agreements with mid-sized distribution firms. The Fayetteville property had been converted over 18 months into a 12-unit live workspace for small creative and commercial operations. It was 91% occupied. Its current appraised value was $1.4 million. Camille had been told it was a storage facility used by his firm. She had never asked a follow-up question. Franklin listened to all of this and wrote 3 things on his legal pad and then put down his pen. "She doesn't know about the patent," he said. "No," said Darius. "She doesn't know about the holding entity." "No, she married the logistics manager." Franklin looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "How long have you been the other thing?" "The whole time," Darius said. "I just never needed to explain it." 3 days later, Darius drove out to Stone Mountain to his Uncle Bernard's house, where Bernard had lived for 27 years since retiring from the Air Force, and where the kitchen always smelled of the red beans Bernard kept on the stove from Friday through Sunday without fail. Bernard was 68 years old, widowed, and possessed of the specific clarity that arrives in men who have spent their lives making decisions with incomplete information under conditions that did not permit indecision. He listened to Darius without interrupting, which was his way, and then poured them both coffee and sat back down. "Your mother told me once, when you were about 12, that you were the kind of boy who figured out the ending before anyone else and then waited quietly for everyone else to catch up." He wrapped both hands around his mug. The ones it made uncomfortable were always the ones who hadn't done their own figuring. He was quiet for a moment. "Let your lawyer do the legal work. You do what you've always done. Wait until you're certain, and then move." Marissa Delacroix was the forensic accountant Franklin retained, and she was 44 years old and had the manner of a woman who had examined the financial ruins of enough failed marriages to have developed both deep expertise and a complete absence of surprise. She reviewed the joint account records, the credit card statements, the patent royalty documentation, the holding entity records, and the Fayetteville appraisal over 4 business days, and produced a 31-page report that opened with an executive summary stating, in precise and unadorned language, that Camille had removed or directed the removal of $61,000 from marital assets over 19 months in a pattern consistent with deliberate concealment, and that this amount, combined with the marital waste represented by the $38,000 in undisclosed credit charges, represented a total of $99,000 in recoverable assets under Georgia divorce statutes. She had also calculated, as a separate matter, the full asset picture Camille had been unaware of: the patent, the holding entity, the Fayetteville property, and had noted at the bottom of the summary, in the flat voice of a professional who recorded facts without editorializing, the disparity between what the respondent believed she was obtaining and what the petitioner actually holds is substantial. Darius had read that line twice and then set the report in his folder with everything else. The week before the airport, Darius had continued to come home at his normal time and eat dinner and ask reasonable questions about Camille's day, and fix the loose towel bar in the guest bathroom that had been loose for 6 months. He had kissed her cheek on Monday evening, and she had accepted it with the ease of someone who believed the performance was still working. He had sat across from her at dinner on Tuesday and listened to her describe a conversation with her sister, and had registered the specific quality of her comfort. The deep, unguarded comfort of a person who does not know they are already 3 moves behind, and had felt not triumph but something quieter and more complicated. The feeling a builder has when a structure he has spent months preparing finally reaches the moment where the next thing is simply to let it complete itself. The trip was legitimate. A supply chain summit in Phoenix, 2 days, booked through his firm's travel department under his name, with a hotel confirmation and an agenda. He had also, separately and without mentioning it to anyone at the firm, booked the Challenger through the travel management company for the return leg. Because the return leg was not going to be about Phoenix. It was going to be about a meeting in Scottsdale with the second of the 2 licensing firms that held agreements on the patent, a firm that had been in preliminary discussions with Darius and his co-patent holder about a restructured agreement that would increase the annual royalty income significantly, and that required his physical presence to finalize. The meeting had been arranged for 3 months. It had nothing to do with Camille. It was simply the next thing in a life that had been proceeding on its own logic, regardless of what Camille had been doing beside it. She had insisted on coming to the airport. He had not discouraged it, because there was no reason to. She had been quiet in the car, and he had been quiet in the car, and when they reached the departure level she had helped him with the checked bag, and then something had shifted in the way it sometimes shifted with her. A change in weather, rapid and without announcement, and she had said things that were designed to diminish, and he had listened without response, and then she had reached for the carry-on bag handle and pulled, and something in the mechanics of that pull had become a throw, and, The suitcase had crossed 8 feet of polished terminal floor and come to rest against the baggage cart, and 3 people had turned their heads. He walked to it. He checked the wheels. He set it upright. He looked at her for a moment. He did not raise his voice. He did not respond to what she had been saying. He said, "Take care of yourself, Camille." And then he picked up the suitcase and walked to where the man in the dark jacket was waiting, who turned without ceremony and walked him through the priority entrance, down a corridor she had no access to, toward a gate she did not know, where the Challenger's stairs were already down and the cabin attendant was waiting with the particular unhurried readiness of someone accustomed to people who moved without drama toward their actual destinations. Camille was served 6 days later, upon Darius's return to Atlanta, by a process server who found her at the house in Cascade Heights at 9:40 in the morning. The dissolution filing was accompanied by a motion for recovery of marital waste, a forensic accounting summary prepared by Marissa Delacroix, and a financial disclosure form from Darius that listed, for the first time, the full extent of what the inventory contained. The patent, the holding entity, the Fayetteville property, the travel management account, the Bombardier. Camille called her attorney 20 minutes after being served. Her attorney called Franklin. Franklin took the call, listened to the opening position, and said, "I'll tell you what my client is and isn't willing to discuss. But before we start, you should read page 14 of the disclosure." All of page 14. He waited. He could hear the sound of pages turning on the other end of the line. Then silence. "Take the weekend," he said pleasantly, and ended the call. The settlement conference took place on a Thursday in a conference room at Franklin's office in Buckhead. Chosen deliberately because it was Franklin's office and the quality of the furniture communicated, without aggression, that some rooms are built from a particular kind of certainty. Camille arrived with her attorney and an expression composed carefully at its edges. Derek Solis was not present. His name appeared on page 7 of the forensic accounting report, which was among the documents laid out when Camille arrived. She saw her own name on the cover. She saw Derek's name when she turned to page 7. She looked at the table, and then looked at Darius. He was looking at something past her left shoulder. He was thinking about the Fayetteville properties north, facing gutters, and a conversation he needed to have with his patent co-holder, and a text Paulette had sent about Thanksgiving, which she was already planning with the specificity of a woman who understood that the meal was not the point. The gathering was the point, and that gatherings required preparation. He was thinking about all of this. He was not thinking about Camille. Marissa Delacroix walked through the 31-page report in 40 minutes, page by page, in the flat, precise voice of a professional. The $61,000 in marital waste, the $38,000 in undisclosed charges, the full disclosure of Darius's assets, the appraisal of the Fayetteville property, the patent royalties, the holding entity's financials. Camille's attorney asked 2 questions. Franklin answered both. Then Franklin turned to the final page of his own document packet and slid it across the table. "My client's settlement position," he said. "You'll find it straightforward." Camille read it. Her attorney read it. Her attorney leaned close and spoke quietly. Camille set the page down. "I didn't know," she said. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone holding something carefully. She looked at Darius. "About any of it?" "I didn't know." Darius looked at her directly for the first time since she sat down. "I know you didn't," he said. His voice was even and without heat. "That was your choice. You made assumptions about a man you never fully looked at, and you built your plan on those assumptions." He straightened the papers in front of him, the way a man straightens things when he has said what he needed to say. "I'm not angry about it. I just needed you to see it clearly." He stood. He nodded to Franklin. He walked out of the conference room and took the elevator to the lobby and stepped out into the Buckhead afternoon, where the November air was sharp and the trees along Peachtree were holding their last color. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. 10 months later, Darius Wynn was sitting in the courtyard of the Fayetteville property on a Saturday morning in late September, drinking his coffee and reviewing a revised lease proposal from the woodworking studio in Unit 4. The courtyard had been his design, brick pavers salvaged from a demolition project in Decatur, a central water feature running off a recirculating pump he had installed himself, raised planters along the south wall, where the tenants had organized a small communal garden that had produced, by the end of summer, more tomatoes than anyone knew what to do with. The Fayetteville property had been refinanced in August at a valuation of $1.6 million. The patent restructuring finalized in Scottsdale had brought the annual royalty figure to $112,000. He had taken on a second rental property in East Point, a 1940s duplex with the same quality of bones he always looked for, and had begun the renovation the previous month. The work settled him. It always had. Simone Augustine had entered his life sideways, the way things did when you stopped arranging them. She was an architect referred by the engineer he used for structural assessments, brought in to consult on a mixed-use adaptive reuse project in Decatur. They had met on a job site in November. She had looked at the building the way Darius looked at buildings, reading it, not just seeing it. She had asked him what he thought the building wanted to be, which was not a question most people asked. He had told her. She was exacting and funny in equal measure and did not perform either quality. She was not the center of his Saturday morning. She was simply present in it, inside the building behind him, making coffee in the kitchen of the unit he now kept as his own. What he knew of Camille came through Franklin, who mentioned it briefly in the context of a closed matter. She had relocated to a condo in Sandy Springs. She had moved firms. Derek Solis had ended the arrangement within 3 months of the settlement filing, which Franklin had predicted with the confidence of a man who had seen enough of what pressure revealed in people. Her professional network in Atlanta had contracted. The settlement had been fair and documented and final. Darius set the lease proposal down on the brick of the planter beside him. The morning light was coming through the courtyard at an angle that made the salvaged brick look warm and deliberate, which it was. He had chosen every piece. He had laid every course. He had built the thing from what had been discarded elsewhere and made it into something people wanted to be inside of. He heard Simone moving in the kitchen. He heard the particular sound of the second coffee cup being lifted from the shelf. He looked at the courtyard and the garden and the water feature running its quiet loop, and felt the specific quality of peace that belongs to a man who has done the work correctly and is now standing in the result of it. Some things you build once and they hold. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.